I want to give you a quick preview of the video you're about to see. It's a part of our cybersecurity series, and in this session we brought together Fireye's threat intelligence team to give us an update on what's going on in the cybersecurity space. Additionally, in this session we brought together a wide variety of panelists across the C-suite to understand what they're discussing at the executive staff and boardroom level. It was an intriguing interactive summit across all parts of the session. With that, I want to thank both Fireye as well as the Los Altos Tasting Room where we hosted the event and the Byington Winery, and I hope you enjoy the video.
My name is Lee Foster. I run a specialist intelligence team at Fireye that's focused on identifying hostile influence campaigns that use cyber threat activity or malicious online behavior to try to influence audiences. So if you think about things like Russia's election interference, the recent Iranian influence campaign that we uncovered and reported on, that's the kind of space we operate in. My team also looks at what you might consider more traditional hacktivist activity as well. And my team is just one of many different specialist intelligence teams within the Fireye intelligence division. And I can talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. But what I wanted to do in this presentation is talk about information operations and kind of what I do in my space, and then try to communicate some ideas, at least from my perspective, as to why private sector entities should be worried about this threat, despite the most prominent examples to date being very much in the political realm. So I'm going to do a brief introduction on IO and traditional cyber threats. I then want to go through a couple of case studies of prominent information operations activity that we've seen over the past couple of years. That is Russia's 2016 and since activity, and then the recent Iranian influence operation. And then part 3 here, kind of cut off in the middle of the screen. How can information operations affect private sector businesses? And I'm going to talk about 3 areas where I think this matters. 1, businesses being used as tools in operations. 2, businesses being targeted directly as part of operations. And thirdly, businesses being used indirectly to support narratives as part of operations. Then I'm going to finish up with some what I consider important considerations that I think people should be thinking about when they think about these types of threats to their organizations. And then if we have additional questions at the end, obviously we'll have time there. I have some note cards here, which are just kind of my fact-checking cards, so please excuse me if I have to look down. I want to make sure I get particular dates right or numbers right. So let's start with traditional cyber threats. So you're all familiar with cyber threat activity, and often in terms of motivations, these are classified in terms of espionage, both nation state and corporate, cybercrime, anything kind of financially motivated, very common obviously, targeting private sector entities, hacktivism, and here I kind of specify opportunistic and ego-driven in particular, because in some ways hacktivism can actually be considered a subset of information operations. So when I list hacktivism separately there, I'm talking really about the kind of script kiddies that DDoS your site just because they want to see if they can do it. But it's not necessarily trying to convey a message or influence some sort of outcome. Destructive attacks have obviously received quite prominent attention in recent years, and there's a lot of worry about what nation states are doing to infiltrate, for example, Western infrastructure and networks to just purely cause damage. And then there's information operations, and what I'm arguing here is that I think we need to start thinking about information operations as a traditional cyber threat, something else that we need to worry about. And when I talk about information operations, it's not a clearly defined space, but the way we like to think about it is that it is the use of malicious cyber activity or concerted, inauthentic online behavior that's designed to manipulate, influence, or otherwise shape the behavior of target audiences. So this is all about influencing particular outcomes or thought processes. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, as I mentioned, I want to go into a couple of case studies. And the first is Russia's 2016 influence activity. This has obviously received prominent media attention, but only a fraction of it, surprisingly. So you may be familiar with Guccifer 2 and DC leaks. These are what we call false hacktivist personas. They're kind of set up to pretend to be traditional hacktivists, but were actually part of a Russian intelligence operation to try to manipulate US politics, targeting the DNC, targeting a number of American politicians and so on, leaking stolen data that was taken from compromised email accounts and compromised organizational networks. What is less known, though, is that there were a number of other false hacktivist personas that Russia also deployed that same year, not just against the US, but more globally as well. So down here we have Anonymous Poland. Now, Anonymous Poland emerges in mid-2016, targeting Ukrainian targets, including, I believe, government, military, and a couple of corporate entities as well. Operating in exactly the same way, leaking data, and then pushing narratives around that as to, why Ukrainians are bad. And as the summer progresses, the Anonymous Poland persona suddenly switches track. At the same time that Russia faces a ban from the Olympics because of its doping scandal, the Anonymous Poland persona says that it's now going to target anti-doping agencies and leak data from them, and as well as DDoS their sites and so on, and engages in a couple of defacements and then goes completely silent, just disappears. Yet, a couple of days later, the Fancy Bears hack team persona pops up instead. Now, Fancy Bears, you may or may not know, is CrowdStrike's name for what we call APT28, the Russian espionage actor, but has since moved into information operations as well.
Can you give everyone just an overview of what an APT means, and when does it become APT? Because I think that will help.
Yeah, so APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Now, traditionally, this corresponds to espionage groups. And the graduation to an APT is kind of a complex intelligence question, but it basically revolves around isolating a distinct set of activity, TTPs, infrastructure, and so on, that kind of clearly allude to a specific group of actors. And this can sometimes be difficult to do because different parts overlap. And in fact, what CrowdStrike calls Fancy Bear may differ slightly to what we conceptualize as APT28. But in general, that's kind of the translation that we're looking there. So in the summer of 2016, this new persona, Fancy Bear's hack team, which incidentally is still using anonymous iconography in the same way as Anonymous Poland was, starts leaking confidential medical records from the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA. These included what are known as therapeutic use exemptions. These are documents that state a particular athlete is permitted to use an otherwise banned substance for medical purposes. And so they start leaking all of these confidential medical records and pushing these narratives that actually Western athletes are also engaged in illegal doping, and therefore, why is Russia, being banned from the Olympics? And this is a very common tactic we see from Russian entities, in which, for the most part, they leak real data and they just spin it, right? And there's nothing controversial about the actual data whatsoever, but they were very careful to spin up particular narratives around it on social media to try and push this story otherwise. There was some falsified material in there, and I'll kind of talk, I think, on my last slide a little bit about, the implications of this. But to keep moving forward in this case study, Fancy Bear's hack team starts leaking all of this Olympic-themed material and becomes kind of the anti-Western sports false hacktivist entity. And then in October, Anonymous Poland comes back, and suddenly it's really interested in the US elections. So it starts leaking documents from the Bradley Foundation, which is a right-leaning charity in the Midwest somewhere, and leaks these fake documents saying that they were donating illegal amounts of money to Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I'll show some examples of that again later. Concurrently, we have in the middle here the Pravsector persona. Now, Pravsector is purported to be the kind of cyber arm of the Ukrainian youth nationalist group, Pravy Sector. And Pravsector emerges and starts targeting Polish entities, like the Ministry of Defense and the telecommunications entity Netia. And so these two personas start having this online spat over Twitter, you know, with some quite coarse language, and they're leaking documents from respective targets in each other's countries, trying to stir up animosity between Ukraine and Poland at the time that the July, I think it was July 2016, NATO Warsaw Summit was due to take place. Now, obviously, Russia has an inherent interest in preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. And so there's all of this kind of activity going on here. Separately, and the bottom one here is Bozkurt hackers. Bozkurt hackers refers to the Grey Wolves, which is a Turkish youth nationalist group. They actually emerge in the end of 2015 and kind of operate through spring of 2016. So it kind of precurses the rest of this activity. But Bozkurt hackers leaks data from various Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian banks, and again spins up narratives around how these accounts belong to British and American spies, disparaging the Qatari royal family, and so on. And so all of these personas kind of took on a particular theme, a particular focus, and for the most part, they adhered to it, and then others, like Anonymous Poland, kind of veered all over the place, which in itself was extremely suspicious. Now, we were tracking all of this activity over 2016, and we produced this like 120-page report on these personas and all of their activity and how they were acting on social media and so on. And one of the graphics in there we include is this, which is just kind of trying to illustrate on a basic level the overlap between the activity of these false hacktivist personas, remember these are pretending to be just independent hacktivist groups, and APT-28, the Russian espionage intrusion operator, and the linkages between these groups and APT-28 in terms of infrastructure and targeting, as well as the linkages between the personas themselves in terms of their social media activity. And I've got a good example here. What I've got here is a bunch of different screenshots of Twitter accounts affiliated with some of these personas. So QNB refers to Qatar National Bank, which was one of Bozkurt hackers' purported targets. And you'll notice these are actually all different accounts. They have different account names there, differentiated by the number of underscores they have in their names. Likewise, you'll see here these GOP accounts. These were affiliated with Anonymous Poland, as were the Clinton corruption accounts here. And again, they all have different usernames, but they've all adopted the same kind of imagery, name, and so on. And I think the anti-global ones in the middle here corresponded to some Bozkurt hackers' activity, again promoting leaks from these banks. Now, what we uncovered was, I think, over 24 distinct networks like this, of hundreds or even thousands of accounts that would tweet in alphabetical order on a consistent basis 5 to 8 times per minute to try and get particular narratives trending, to try and influence the national conversation. A big one of these was on election night in 2016. Anonymous Poland, the actual persona I showed you on the previous slide, tweets this derogatory tweet about Hillary Clinton and then the hashtag war on Democrats. And then immediately over the course of the next 5 hours, we see thousands of accounts start posting this war against Democrats hashtag. As an interesting aside, to us, that suggests that probably Russia was gearing up, expecting a Clinton presidency, and was gearing up to try to undermine that for the next 4 years. And it seems they had everything in place to do so, and then obviously the result differed. On the left here, we just see some of the imagery used by Fancy Bear's hack team. I have a peculiar admiration for their graphics department, whoever it is that does these, because they do some fantastic graphics like this. I mean, right? This is about, you know, I don't know if that particular skier, but, you know, again, you know, the use of certain medications, right, for legitimate medical purposes, being portrayed as illegal doping. And then they put these great little images together here. So I guess if any of you have worked in investigations or law enforcement, you probably have that kind of appreciation sometimes for the adversary that you're fighting against. So that's the Russia kind of campaigns. Does anybody have any questions on the Russia 2016 activity for now before I move to Iran? Microphone.
Are you going to get into what this means for the upcoming?
Oh, that's my CDS presentation. So you should go to DC for Fireye's annual conference if you want to get the inside scoop on that. I mean, I can talk very briefly about that if you're interested. There were 3 prongs to Russia's 2016 election influence activity. Number 1 was this type of activity, what we call hack and leak. So APT28 compromises the DNC, John Podesta's emails, and so on. It's passed down the hall to whoever is kind of running these false personas, and that's pushed out on social media with certain narratives. The second strand, which you may be aware of, is what's commonly referred to as trolling, and kind of the St. Petersburg Troll Farm Internet Research Agency, which is again leveraging social media to push narratives, but it wasn't reliant on actual network compromises and stolen data. It was purely, you know, pushing out controversial commentary and narratives around socially divisive issues in the US in an attempt to kind of sow discord within the general populace. And the kind of regular announcements you see from social media companies and like the advertisements that they took out and so on kind of fall under that bucket of activity. The third strand that we saw in 2016 was the probing of election infrastructure, voter registration databases, and so on. No evidence has emerged, you know, yet that any active manipulation took place on any of those. But I always caution people, that doesn't need to happen for it to have an impact, right? All you have to do is undermine confidence and trust in the electoral process, and you've already won. So frankly, if Russia was able to compromise the voting systems of 1 or 2 counties, and then strategically leak the fact that that happened, you know, that could have dire consequences for trust in democratic institutions in the US.
Yep.
So it looks like you look at sort of a fingerprint of activity and you connect the dots.
Yep.
How much of that is sort of incontroversial, definitely true, versus how much of it is sort of takes more of a leap of judgment to sort of say, nah, this feels connected because the graphics are similar,
Right.
which would be different than being able to trace maybe IP addresses.
We'll talk a little bit about that in the Iranian context, where we do have technical indicators to link, for example, some of the sites and accounts to each other. In the context of this, I mean, it's really, so I'm an intelligence analyst, so it's all about forming a comprehensive judgment based on all the different inputs, right? And so I always say that if you took any one piece of evidence that we use, that's not going to be conclusive of everything. It's when you start putting that all together, you start to reduce uncertainty, and the potential for other explanations quickly dissipate. And so, let's see if I can go back on this slide. Here, as I mentioned, you know, there were certain technical overlaps in terms of the data that was being leaked by some of these personas and known APT28 intrusions that, you know, could kind of create that linkage there. And when you put that, when you analyze that in the context of political dynamics and, you know, what would Russia's interest be in doing something like that, you know, it's kind of combining those different pieces together.
But is there a standard of judgment? You know, how is it like being a wine connoisseur? I'll use that because we're in Benny's tasting room, but where people have sort of a, you know, a Michelin rating, or how do you decide if it's
so
enough?
I'm not a wine connoisseur, so I don't want to, you know, misplace this. We don't make these decisions in a binary fashion. We assign confidence levels to our assessments. So some things might be high confidence, some may be low. I believe these 5 were high confidence assessments by the time we had finished looking at all of the evidence, and Boskurt hackers was like a medium to a low because of the slightly different dynamics to it. However, we were able to connect Boskurt hackers to these personas because of this identical type of activity here. I came from the Eyesight Partners acquisition, which Fireye bought in 2016, and Eyesight Partners had been tracking hacktivist activity for 10 years by that point. We had never seen anything like this, and then suddenly this year you have these 4 brand new personas coming out with this identical behavior. As I said, alphabetized accounts, a very set consistency of posting, trying to manipulate things. That was quite unusual, and we would even look at that as a potential indicator of these accounts being, these personas being linked to each other, which is why, we see some connections here between the actual personas as well.
Hey, can I ask? Sorry. So to get back to the question you were saying, and Lee, you can add on more intelligently to this, but at any given time, we are monitoring 1,500 threat groups across at least Fireye. I'm sure other companies are monitoring more. And there's a lot of due diligence. So we call this like frontline expertise. So our threat intel body, our Mandiant consultants who are on the front lines are monitoring this. And I think we have over, keep me honest here, 2 decades of connections, so 20 million connections between nation-state sponsors and threat actors and groups. So the reason I was asking Lee to expand on APT and to get back to your question, like how do you know whether this is a group you need to pay attention to or not, is because of that assessment. And it's also, as you get really good at assessing this, you know what you should be paying attention to or not. And I don't know, Lee is a rock star, by the way, and if you don't know, are you gonna get into the Iran story and all of that? Okay, so he'll talk about that story and why we even flag that. But there's a lot of deep research, machine and humans, which goes into it, and we're constantly monitoring. Then from these groups, these 1,500 groups, we elevate them, and this is just from one perspective, right, to something called temp.group, and it's still not the exact level of APTs, and then from that we get to APTs. So there's a lot of like intelligence which goes into that. So hopefully that answers some of it.
Thank you. To us, it's not about proving it in a court of law. It's about making an informed judgment based on the information and evidence available to us. And as I said, in this context, we were able to get this to high confidence based on a number of different indicators we were able to compile together. So the second example I wanted to walk through with you is the recent Iranian influence operation that we uncovered. And you may have heard about this in the media. It generated quite a lot of attention because based on our findings, Facebook and Google were able to actually go onto their platforms and take down quite a significant number of accounts and pages that were part of this campaign. And we were able to provide that kind of initial impetus that allowed them to use their back-end data. Of course, they always have, better data in terms of being able to connect different accounts based on technical indicators. They're able to use what we had provided to pivot and then unmask a lot of additional activity. And so what we uncovered was a network of what we call inauthentic news sites, and we say they're inauthentic because they are masking their true origins and affiliations, not necessarily pushing out fake material, but they may be putting it out in a biased way. A lot of the material was actually stolen from legitimate media and then interspersed with fake stories as well. And we identified a number of these different websites. Now, when we went public with this, we had 6 sites. We have, I think, just short of 20 others that we've also unmasked as part of this to give you a kind of an indication of just how complex this operation was. And it started with this site here, libertyfrontpress.com, which was kind of a US-focused political news site. The Liberty Front Press, as well as these other sites, US Journal, Real Progressive Front, British Left, Critics Chronicle, and the Instituto Mancahu, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's a Latin American focus site. All of these had affiliated social media accounts that were stood up solely to push content from these sites, to push it out there, dedicated pages on social media to push material out to specific audiences. The audiences, we identified were US, UK, Latin American, and Middle East. I don't think any of the Middle Eastern sites are on this graphic. Oh, actually, some of them like Liberty Front Press and Real Progressive Front, had multiple sub-accounts and sites dedicated to different places. So there's like a Real Progressive Front Syria and Yemen, and so on. British Left obviously was focused on the UK, as was Critics Chronicle. Liberty Front Press, US Journal, focused on the US. So these new sites have been stood up. They're pushing out content that is thematically in line with an Iranian political interests, and by that I mean very heavy on the anti-Saudi and anti-Israeli narratives, very heavy on the pro-Palestinian narratives, very heavy on the anti-Trump administration narratives following the breakdown of the Iran-US nuclear agreement. So you have these concerted sites and affiliated social media accounts pushing all this content out. We also identified a number of networks of what we called unaffiliated social media accounts. These are accounts that did not purport to have any affiliation with any of these sites, but nonetheless were heavily pushing that content anyway. And it's kind of cut off here, but this is one set of them. This set of accounts here, they were all pretending to be American liberal, left-leaning voters, but pushing this heavy Middle East-focused content out from the Liberty Front Press site. What do these arrows here show? In the blue, we're showing the crossover, the overlap of social media promotional activity. So you would have Liberty Front Press accounts pushing content from Liberty Front Press, but then they might also be pushing content from some of these other sites like US Journal. And that's the way we were able to kind of get back at your question, to then start unmasking additional sites and additional accounts, because we were looking at, well, who's pushing what and where. And we saw a lot of overlap here. And so those blue lines basically indicate that you could take one site and its set of social media accounts, and they were pushing content from other sites as well and other sets of social media accounts, and you could start unmasking this network. So one of the indicators there you have, obviously, is the connection to, the overlap with Iranian political interests in terms of content promotion. There's also a number of technical indicators pointing to Iran. So the Liberty Front Press site shared a registered email address with an Iranian site, yemenshir.com, which was active in 2014 and 2015. There's a question over there, Brian, by the way. We'll grab that first.
As you talk about how to investigate the sources of these and go back to the technical aspects of it, did you see any correlations with the infrastructure they were using? So the websites they were registering, the registries, the IP addresses they were using, or were they just using publicly available sources and just funding it to make sure they can mask it?
Yeah, so we use publicly available Whois records to, unmask these connections. So we saw shared registrant email addresses, shared domain hosts, and so on. But the social media companies, Facebook and Google, when they came out with their public announcements regarding this activity, actually provided additional context there. Google even came out and said, we can connect on the back end this activity to Iranian state press, because they were seeing the same people log in, to official accounts and then to accounts affiliated with this network. So collectively, there's a lot of technical evidence there on that. When we put this out as moderate confidence, again, getting back to my intelligence language, because that's based on what we can see, the evidence we have. So we're not going to come out and say this is high confidence Iranian. If we don't have the evidence to say that, we're saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. We assess with moderate confidence this is Iranian, and here is why. Social media companies, if you take their evidence into that calculation as well, it becomes high confidence very quickly. But we maintain our independence there in terms of what we're seeing and how we present that. So to get back just briefly what I was talking about here, shared registrant email addresses with an Iranian website, which in 2015 was heavily promoting, again, Middle Eastern political content. That itself shared a registrant email address with a different Iranian website, which could positively be ID'd as Iranian. And that itself, at one point, had a different registrant email address that linked it to one of these other sites. So we were able to kind of form that technical loop there, and there's an additional technical indicator there. So you've got that component, then you've got the shared overlap of social media activity. That, to us, kind of gets this to that moderate confidence level.
We got a question. Scott, go ahead.
Scott Landstrom, SCI. I guess the thing I'm struggling with is that, and this is probably blatantly obvious to you and your comrades, but not to maybe lay people, with the interference and the stealing of democratic emails and leaking them, and it's pretty clear what the end game was, and that was regime change or preventive regime change, depending on how you look at it. What is the end game for some of these other organizations? I mean, they're affecting share of mind, but share of mind by itself isn't, in a quarter will get you a cup of coffee, right?
Right.
Well, what is the end game that they're trying to affect?
So if you're asking in context of the Iranian operation particularly? Or
Virtually any of them, other than, I mean, it was clear to me that when the Russian organizations were trying to affect public sentiment prior to the U.S. elections, that it was regime change that was the end game.
Yeah.
Well, what is the end game for these other organizations?
So I'd push back a little on necessarily the regime change component of the Russian-US activity. The evidence to us suggested it was really about creating social divisions within the US and undermining the future president. Again, as I said earlier, it looked like they were expecting Clinton to win, and so at least originally it looked like what they were trying to do is just sow enough distrust and animosity within the US populace that the president wouldn't be able to focus on, Russian issues in Syria and Ukraine and so on, because they'd be battling their entire, time in office to try and hold the country together, right? And that's why we see so much activity, and even now on this side, in terms of amplifying national social divisive issues, such as race relations and gun rights and things like that, because those are the emotional things that people get really invested in, and is the reason why you hear stories today about how people aren't talking to their own families and so on, right? So that a lot of that activity was geared towards that. Now, as the election season progressed, it looks like a more concerted attempt was actually made to try and bolster Trump's campaign in particular and undermine Clinton's. But given the timing of the activity and so on, that looks like that became a secondary motive over time and not necessarily the primary purpose. So in that context, it was more about creating these social divisions. Now in others, like the Fancy Bears hack team activity, which is targeting, Olympics and so on, that may just be about trying to promote or reinforce Russia's place on the world stage. Russians are very prideful about that kind of sporting prowess and so on, right? And so there may just simply be a kind of national reputational issue kind of motivating that particular campaign. As I said in some of the others, stirring up animosity between Ukraine and Poland appeared to be the driving factor of one component of all of that 2016 activity, and I can't remember the specific incident, unfortunately, but there was heavy promotion regarding a 1930s genocide, which I want to say it was Ukraine did to Poland, but it may have been the opposite, so don't quote me on that. I'll become part of an operation myself, won't I? Can I just finish on this point as well? And then in the context of this Iranian activity, this seems to be just purely traditional propaganda, but kind of taken into this kind of social media realm. So really it varies depending on the actor behind it and the particular issue and event. In the Russian context, it was clear to us that Russia was able to just pivot off of the infrastructure they'd set up to pursue whatever political issue of the day was on their minds. And Anonymous Poland is a great example of that because it was just so haphazard in terms of where its focus was. So, it varies by actor. Does that kind of answer your question there? Or?
So my question is, you have theories for what are the motivations. How much of this might be economically driven in some way?
That's something we continue to look at, and I'm going to get to that concept at the end of this presentation. The potential for this type of activity to be used for economic purposes is a big worry of mine, in addition to the obvious worries that this is going to continue to be used in political ways, as in such a way to undermine democratic institutions. But I think the actual techniques employed are readily transferable. And I'll show a couple of cases of that towards the end.
Maybe two comments. So one comment is you might take a look at Tesla and what the shorts are doing around negative news. I think it's fascinating to see how much energy is going in to try to drive the stock down.
Yeah.
The second is it looks like this is kind of a follow the email trail, follow the data, follow the message that you use to track and link things together, and then that builds your case on how confident you are. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah. In some cases, when, for example, there's a leak of data and then we start seeing narratives around it, it's very easy to kind of follow that trail.
So follow the message through.
In the case, in this context, in the Iranian context, interestingly enough, we're seeing all this political messaging, and there's still a lot of art involved in this, and it was, our analysts were looking at this and saying, this is really weird. Why are these American personas so heavily, interested in this activity? And one thing that, in particular, that we identified early on is they were heavily pushing Quds Day, which is an Iranian holiday created to celebrate Palestine and, kind of disparage Israel, right? And you have all of these, American liberals, supposedly all over the country, heavily tweeting out Quds Day. Like, it's just, and so a lot of the time we kind of see messages and they seem inconsistent with the personas that are pushing them out. And so we'll do further investigation around that. In the case of something like this, when the content is high in volume and solely in that space, it becomes quite obvious that this is a dedicated effort to try and promote a particular agenda. One thing we've noticed, particularly from Russia, is given all the publicity around this activity, they've got much better at building kind of believable backgrounds to a lot of their accounts. So it's not necessarily that they're doing it at such a high volume that it's obviously automated, or that they're focused only solely on this one kind of issue that it's concerted towards that. They're getting better at making them look like real people, and that's actually making our job a lot tougher. Just to give you an indication of what we're seeing here, again, linking different parts together. These are different Twitter accounts for different real progressive front. That's one of the sites there, things. And you can see kind of overlapping iconography heavily across those accounts. So that's, again, something, that would speak to us. And again, these Liberty Front Press ones, using that same branding, that same iconography. That's a quick and easy way to try to identify different accounts across different social media platforms. This took place everywhere. Not just Facebook and Twitter, Google, Instagram, Reddit. This was a big effort to get all these accounts in place. Okay, changing gears then, because I know I've kind of talked a lot about political I/O, and I don't know how politically inclined a lot of you are, but you may be asking yourselves, well, why does this really matter to me then? Given this is about elections and so on, or in some cases, kind of Eastern European politics and things like that. And I want to make an argument here that there are three areas that I think private sector businesses should be concerned about when it comes to these types of influence campaigns. Number one is your platforms, your businesses actually actively being used as part of these campaigns. Number two is you directly being targeted by these campaigns, and three, being indirectly targeted, and that may kind of involve reputational risk and so on, to support narratives targeting some other individual or entity, which is something we saw in 2016 with the elections, as I'll show you. So, starting with businesses as tools for operations. Now, you're all familiar, obviously, that social media companies have been pulled up in front of Congress multiple times now to explain their role in 2016's election interference activity. That's a business risk, right? And you know, social media companies have said they're investing heavily into improving security and so on. Well, that's a cost, right? And so this stuff matters to you as a business. So I put social media platforms up there as kind of the obvious type of vehicle that is going to be affected by this type of activity, even if it's not actually directly targeting them. And I don't know the specifics of what all you do in this room or what companies you're investing in and so on, but one thing I would implore you to do is think about how could, you know, my business or the businesses I'm financing be used to support these types of operations to the point that the US government or the British government, because they're also big on this, or other governments are going to come in and start demanding answers as to what are you doing about this, what role did you play, and so on, right? That's going to affect your bottom line. So it's important to think about that. So social media companies are the obvious example. Messaging apps, you know, this is quite common in India, for example. There's a lot of activity being reported on regarding WhatsApp and how that's being used to kind of motivate flash mobs that have ended up killing people, right, based on rumors and kind of false stories. So that again is something, you know, you would want to be concerned about if you're in that kind of communication space. How can my platform be used maliciously to support these types of operations? Because the thing that really stands out to me about the Russia 2016 activity is how much attention the social media companies have got from the US government and how little attention Russia has got by this, right? I mean, you know, it's been, you watch these congressional hearings, there's a lot of pressure on these companies, right? They're being held responsible for this. And they're not even the ones perpetrating the activity, right? They're just being used. So, you know, that's something to worry about. Hosting services, likewise. And I gave an example here of, you know, Google Drive being used to host stolen data and then leaked, you know, as part of a campaign. This campaign, incidentally, is one of those bizarre ones. So Private Sector, as I said, is the Ukrainian false activist persona being run by Russia. They leaked data from the Central Ohio Urology Lab, a very random target, and claimed this was evidence of a Pentagon bioweapons program. So you can see kind of, you know, how bizarre these narratives can be spun out of completely random data. But I put this slide in here to highlight the fact that, you know, hosting sites, you know, things like Google Drive, Dropbox, whatever it may be, could be used to host malicious content in this way to drive these kinds of campaigns. I put payment platforms there as another idea. You know, there's a lot of reporting out there about how Russia used cryptocurrency platforms and so on to purchase infrastructure to engage in this activity. Obviously, there's an entire black market related to stolen social media accounts or otherwise kind of networks of accounts that have been set up and then sold on for use in this kind of activity. Current and future AI tools. This is a big one. So I'm going to actually, I put them now. I was going to consult my my note on that last one. I've lost them. Never mind. Don't need them. I wanted the specifics. What's my notes? Because I wanted to read the banner. I can't quite read it here. But at the top there is this video that was promoted in 2015 on YouTube by accounts that we assess were affiliated with the Internet Research Agency. This is the famous Russian St. Petersburg troll farm. Promoting this video of activists unfurling this banner from the top of the Chicago Tribune building. And it says something like, no freedom of the press, something about buying into lies, don't support Ukrainian aggression, and then some random hashtag there to try and get it, tweeting it was something like save the Donbass people or something, right? It's an area in Crimea. So they're heavily promoting this video of these activists unfurling this banner. And of course the video is fake, right? The banner's been superimposed on top of a tourist video from 2012. And if you watch the two videos in conjunction, you can see like the same people walk past at exactly the same time, you know, the angle's all perfect. It's completely faked. And this area is one of my biggest worries. Deepfake, perfect. Deepfakes are, they've generated a lot of attention recently. And that technology is getting better and better. Not just in falsifying images, but in falsifying voices. There's that famous case, I think it was a university, I can't remember the particulars, where they were able to mimic Barack Obama's voice and have him say something that he didn't say. Now imagine deploying that kind of technology to achieve some sort of political aim. Now imagine deploying that type of technology to achieve some sort of economic aim. For example, faking a comment by a rival CEO, that implicates them in some, illegal or immoral behavior, and the impact that could have on, that company's, stock price, bottom line, whatever it may be. This is a really, really scary area, and I really hope that, especially in this area, there are people that are developing the ability to detect these kinds of, fake videos and audio files and so on to counteract that, because otherwise I think we're in a lot of trouble. And so I put that up there because given where we are, a number of you may be involved in the development of certain AI tools, right? And I'd implore you again to think about the implications of that in terms of how it could be used maliciously. Make no mistake, somebody will find a way to use it maliciously, no matter how idealistic you are in your motivations for developing it in the first place. So we have to be conscious of that. And then finally, I put what's next, because I don't know, right? If I was giving this presentation in 2002, I wouldn't even comprehend the existence of a Facebook, right? But look where we are. So I don't know what you're developing now, but think again, how could this be used in this manner to support these types of operations? Microphone.
Where is the microphone?
I have a question, and I can't remember the name of the company, whether it's Adobe or a different company, but I just read recently, like yesterday on LinkedIn, that there's a company which has developed a software which can basically do facial mimicking. What do you know about that? And
yeah, I read
what's
that
next,
a
right?
while
So
ago.
what if someone just takes any of our political leaders or CEOs and creates a different face, and I feel like that's the next step of influence operations. And I can't remember the name of the company.
Yep.
I don't know if you know.
I saw the same thing that you were referring to, but that's entirely my concern, right? Because it's so easy to think about how you could use something like this maliciously, whether to influence a political outcome or for your own economic gain in some way. And so that's why this is on this slide, right? Because I've talked a lot about political I/O, but you have to be worried about how a rival organization in a hostile foreign state could use this type of these types of tools to undermine credibility in your company, its reputation, its bottom line, whatever it may be. That's a big thing to worry about. And again, as I said, the what's next is that's there for the things we can't even comprehend yet. What technology is being invented here that in 10 years' time, could be deployed in this manner. That's something to worry about. I don't know, what's happening. Maybe some really cool hologram capability where you can actually project me and I look real at the front of the room, saying something that I'm not saying. That's something to be concerned about. So that's the first kind of way that I want to highlight businesses can be used or can be affected by information operations. And then finally, businesses as indirect targets to support narratives. So Anonymous Bulgaria emerges in 2017. It's another one of these Russian false hacktivist personas, like Anonymous Poland, playing on the same themes. Leaks data they've stolen from the Azerbaijani embassy in Bulgaria related to Silkway Airlines, which is a private Azerbaijani cargo airline. They leak this data and they spin this narrative that US Special Operations Command and US-based defense contractors are funneling weapons to ISIS via Silkway Airlines, right? So in this context, Silkway Airlines has got caught up in this narrative, and they're not even the target of it, right? The target is the US, right? It's trying to, kind of undermine the US's position in the world, and what better way to do that than to, well, if it was believable, at least, say that they're directly supporting ISIS. And on the right here, you see the same activity I described earlier, war listing, where you have kind of multiple accounts posting the same messages, pushing out this kind of narrative. So Silkway helped terrorists there. I don't know much about Silkway, but if you're sitting on Silkway's kind of board, that's probably concerning to you, right? And so, again, you might think about, well, how could your company be indirectly impacted by these activities and kind of take a reputational hit whilst being used to target some other entity? And I want to highlight this fact and say, well, you may ask, well, what do I do about this? Well, secure your systems, right? I mean, in the same way that you would worry about financial attacks or competitive espionage, your stolen data could be used for this purpose. So make sure you're protecting your networks. Make sure it's all encrypted. Because what happened in this case is actually it got picked up by the mainstream media. So that's Radio France International, big French radio station, actively reporting on what happened. Not necessarily spinning the same narrative, but saying that this is what the anonymous Bulgaria persona is saying. And so this got big traction. In France, Al Jazeera picked it up, Bulgarian and Azerbaijani media picked it up, Armenian media picked it up because, anything that's bad for Azerbaijan is great for Armenia, so it all starts spinning out of control. And you've got this random company that's caught up in this narrative.
Since I'm passionate about this. So, I'm sure many of you are sitting in this room and thinking, well, that's not us. That's happening to someone else in some other world, in some other country. Why do we care, right? Let me give you 2 stats. Hopefully you'll agree with me on this. They're already in your system. They're already in your personal network. So whether you want to believe it or not, however small you are, whether you're a startup or however big you are, it's already happening. 101 days is the dwell time. That's how long an attacker is in your system before they decide whether they want to attack it or not. The choice is, are they going to attack on it or not? That's something they're going to base on how influential you are, whether you matter to them or not, but they're already in your system. It's something to really, really ponder about, right? And there's a lot of detail and a lot of research, and Steve Booth can probably give you a better overview on all the analysis between it. Secondly, if you were attacked before, whether it was influence operations or anything else, you're likely going to be attacked again. 58% of companies, and we work with some of the biggest governments and brands, have been attacked, and not by the same group. So, as we sit in this room, and I love Lee very, very dearly, because I don't think you know his background and what he does and what a big target he himself is, right? The reason we do this is because we see this firsthand. And if we don't realize this, whether it's startup or VCs or your funding companies, or what we're doing and what our responsibility to this world is, we need to do a double take on this, and we need to look at it. So I just wanted to add that, because sometimes we look at this, we're like, Iran and Syria, and who cares? It's all in your system. It's all in your LinkedIn. If you are not affected by it, you might be. It's something to ponder over.
So I've got 2 slides left, I think. This is just another example here. I mentioned this one earlier. So Anonymous Poland leaks fake material in addition to real material from the Bradley Foundation, this kind of right-leaning charity. And the letter says here, Dear Joseph, payment is required for Mrs. Clinton's campaign. In this connection, we will withdraw $150 million from the Rothschild portfolio on July 22nd. 22th, TH, I don't even know how to say that. $150 million is an illegal volume of money for a campaign contribution. It also, I can't remember the number, it's like 1/6 of Clinton's entire campaign budget. I mean, the claim is just ludicrous. And it didn't really get picked up, and there was skepticism about it, which is why we saw a lot of this kind of war listing activity I mentioned before promoting that. But what's interesting here, you see it up here, and in all this messaging, is Rothschilds gets caught up in all of this, right? And this is part of pushing these kind of anti-globalist, anti-Semitic themes that Russia often pushes as part of these campaigns. But again, you have another private organization, completely unrelated to the target of the activity, which is the Clinton campaign, getting caught up in that operation. So it's another example there of how private sector entities can be impacted by these activities even if they're not actually the target of them in any way whatsoever. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to talk about some important considerations that I think about and I think would be worth you thinking about as well. Number one, and hopefully the examples I've given will speak to these pretty readily, but number one, your organization does not have to be political to be useful. Doesn't matter if you're not politicized, they will find a way to spin that data if it serves a particular agenda and purpose. And in fact, a lot of the leaks we see are just legitimate data and then a couple of fake documents thrown in, and then the narrative spun up around those fake documents. There's numerous examples of this. So Fancy Bear's hack team, as I mentioned, would manipulate some of the therapeutic use exemptions they put out. They'd actually change them to try and kind of bolster the narrative they were pushing. The Guccifer 2 persona, when it leaked DNC material, included a folder called Pay to Play, which is very on the nose, but it was at the time when the whole pay to play kind of, controversy, conspiracy theory, it depends how you want to look at it, of Hillary Clinton taking favors from foreign, or taking money, for the Clinton Foundation in exchange for political favors as Secretary of State and so on. And this folder contained a couple of documents in ridiculous English that just was not consistent with any of the other material that was leaked, but that was the thing people started picking up on, right? Oh, maybe there's actually something to this accusation. So it doesn't matter if you're not doing anything wrong. And likewise, it speaks to the second point. Compromised material does not need to be salacious, controversial, or even relevant to be useful. Again, it can be manipulated in a way to make it useful, because we've seen from these actors a willingness to make falsifications, and in some cases only minor falsifications such that it actually alters the materiality of the content. Number three, your organization may be viewed as an extension of your host government, irrespective of any actual associations, commercial or otherwise. If you're putting out a movie that kind of pokes fun at an autocratic leader, and you are seen as kind of reinforcing an imperialist American agenda, you are one and the same as America, whether you have any direct association with the US government or not. We get this a lot. I hear this all the time. Fireye is an arm of the CIA, and it's like, okay, I've been called a Clinton shill as well, based on, whatever. It's just like, you get all of this bizarre kind of, these bizarre accusations coming out. But the fact of the matter to these hostile foreign governments, a host government and the company is one and the same thing. So keep that in mind, right? Just because you don't do business with the US government, where you're affiliated with the US government, other actors may see you as just part of the same thing. I/O may not be necessarily be political, it can also be economic. I said earlier this was a big worry of mine. I've got a couple of examples down here. So in 2013, somebody hacked the Associated Press's Twitter account, don't know who, and put out this fake tweet saying that there was an attack on the White House. The Dow Jones dropped 150 points almost immediately based on that. Now think about how you could manipulate that kind of technique for your own personal gain or whatever it may be, and that's something to be worried about. Another one is this hoax over here on the right. So Vinci is a French construction logistics firm. I think they're involved in some way in patching up Chernobyl, hence the picture there. A fake press release was put out via Bloomberg saying that the company itself had identified irregularities in its accounting practices and had fired its chief accountant. And I believe the stock plunged 18%, over 18% that very day before the company actually came back out and said, no, this is fake, this hasn't happened, and it slowly started to recover. I mean, you can all figure out how you could take advantage of that in that interim period, right, to make a lot of money and the lasting damage that can have to your organization. And then the final part, but business decisions can be political decisions. I'll go back to my example about, putting movies out and so on. Another example is Harley Davidson put out an announcement saying they had to move production overseas because of retaliatory EU tariffs following the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs regarding automobile manufacturers. Somebody put out a fake tweet quoting the CEO of Harley Davidson, calling Trump an idiot. And then that got rapidly retweeted. And I think even famous people like Stephen King at some point had retweeted it as well. So, you know, that was a business decision, right? I need to move production overseas because these tariffs, you know, make this infeasible for me. And it quickly became political and it got caught up in this type of activity. Again, I don't know the specifics of who was behind that. I don't think there's any indications it was a nation state. But it's another example of the way this kind of activity can be abused in that manner. So, again, I don't necessarily have advice for you on here. You know, you have to make business decisions as you make business decisions, but you know, keep in mind how they may be perceived as being politically inclined and what repercussions that may have from politically motivated actors. And that's all I've got. I'm actually surprised it lasted this long. I thought it was going to be like 30 minutes. I appreciate the patience.
So on the heels of Lee providing, you know, a great update on, you know, kind of cybersecurity, what I thought we also wanted to be able to do in this session was really to hear what's going on at the C-suite level with executives, discussions, planning, reactions to things that are happening in their companies, if they've had security breaches, if they can talk about it, maybe prior breaches, what kind of things their roles are supposed to be changing to accommodate needing to understand cybersecurity. If you don't have that in your skill set, you're starting to age yourself out to be able to deal with things like that. Whether or not you're the CISO or the CIO, you need to understand how to accommodate and react to things like that. So that's why we wanted to put the panel together. Some of these people deal with cybersecurity and some don't, but they are hopefully talking about it, you know, on a daily basis with their companies. So what I wanted to do with the panel was to kind of have each person give 3 to 5 minutes of background, and what I would prefer you to do is kind of think 3 things: past, present, and future. Give us a little bit of background, who you are, what brought you into your roles, if there was any security-related things that have come through your history in your roles, whether that's it or not, what you're dealing with today, what's happening at the executive staff or boardroom level in the discussions you're having today, and a little bit of future. What do you see happening in the future, whether it's relative to discussions at executive staff, C-suite, or your specific role? How do you see the skill sets changing if you're a CFO or a CEO or a CMO who's not directly responsible for security things but has to react to things that Lee talked about, whether it's financial impact to the company, brand reputation, things of that nature. So I'll pick on Mike because he's closest to me first. And Mike, you know, obviously have each of you introduce yourself. Mike's a board member, a chairman, 5-time CEO. And so, Mike, can you just, you know, give us your background and then, you know, past, present, future, what you've seen and what you've dealt with relative to anything that's security related, because hopefully, remember, like I said before, you guys are going to be answering or asking the questions. So as we get into the open Q&A part after they've all given their background, I'd like everybody to sort of chime in and ask questions. We should all be trying to figure out what's happening at these CXO level discussions for our own reasons. So Mike, I'll let you go first. Be great to hear sort of your background and what things, you know, you're interacting with and dealing with today as, you know, both a former CEO, maybe what you dealt with, currently chairman, you know, of a number of companies and board member. And then I'll go through the rest of the panelists.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'm probably the least qualified person up here.
Mike probably wondered why I asked him to be on this panel.
Probably the least qualified person to talk about security. As Brian mentioned, I have done the CEO gig quite a few times, 5 different companies, a couple of them public, so both, and then 19 different boards. And so I've got a pretty good flavor in terms of boards, all the way from relatively small companies to pretty good sized companies. And so I thought I'd share a story, though, instead of talking about me.
Sure.
It's because I'm actually kind of boring when it comes from that standpoint. It was interesting. You wind the clock back, and it's public now. I can talk about this. I chair a healthcare company that's got about 8,000 people, and it's 2 o'clock. So it's 2 o'clock in California. It's 4 o'clock in Chicago. My phone rings at my cell phone. I don't put my cell phone in my room anymore. I've got away from that. It's in a different room. My house phone rings. I don't get a call on my house phone, but like once a year, and it's a telemarketer. And so I have it for the security system and opening the gate. That's about it. But my house phone rings, it's 2 o'clock, and it's the CEO of the company in Chicago. And he goes, with a breach, he said, we've actually got an attack, and they've taken over our systems. And we have 150 clients down right now. And now, when you're in the healthcare business and you have hospitals, you can't admit anybody, you can't treat anybody, you can't look at patient records, you can't do anything. And so we're being held hostage. And I said, well, all right, let's talk about it. He said, no, I don't want to talk to you. He says, do you have any Bitcoin? I said, what? He goes, do you have any Bitcoin? He said, they want $50,000 of Bitcoin by morning, and they'll take, they'll get us out of here. And I went, I don't have any Bitcoin. Click. That was the conversation. So it was interesting. So we have a contingency plan. We actually have a scenario plan that we put in place at the board if we got hacked. What do we do? And we literally opened up the book and went through it. Guess what we didn't have in there? Bitcoin. We did not have that in there for ransomware. We had nothing. So it turns out that one of our engineers is actually a Bitcoin miner, of all things. And he had $50,000. We got it moved. Now, if any of you have Bitcoin or any kind of cryptocurrencies and so forth, okay, your hands are down low. It's not like you got them way up here going like that. It's like, yeah, I got it down here. So, these are the thieves of the room. Like, yeah, right here. Here's what's interesting is if you want to go get an account, it's a week. It's like 7-8 days to open up account to get a crypto account. We needed it by morning, if you will. And so Jimmy, one of the guys, we bought the Bitcoin, gave him a little premium on the product that we got from him. And so we had 150 clients down. They were down for 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours. And it was actually kind of in the middle of the night. So these guys are really nice. These hackers were really nice because they gave us time to respond before they opened up. Except, we're dealing all over the world, so time zones were irrelevant. We then opened up our plan. The other plan we had to do is we had to notify everybody. We notified all our clients, not just the 150 on that server network. We notified the press. Last thing you want to do is not tell anybody what happened and try to sweep it under the rug. That's death. And so, we lost $250 million of value that morning in the market, and for $50,000 of Bitcoin. And I'm going, if you're going to go ahead and shake me down, why don't you shake me down for like a really big number? And what we find is, you guys probably know this way better than I do, but that's kind of a common denominator that everybody goes, like, I'll pay it, done. If it's like $10 million, then it's a whole different discussion. But the ransomware was $50,000, we paid it, but the damage that was done was incredible. How we've managed it since, which is fairly interesting, I'll take it to the boardroom, is we have a session, we have cyber experts on the board. I know Fireye, thank you so much for doing this, but we have one of the former founders of Palo Alto on the board, knows the space. And we have a couple other people that are pretty good. We hack ourselves all the time. We hire firms to come in and hack ourselves. We have to worry about HIPAA records, and we have to worry about high trust, and we have all these things we worry about. But yet, there was a comment of how long it stays dormant. We had, on the forensic analysis, the virus sat for a year. A year. And they had just kept watching patterns for a year before they did anything. And then finally, it was like time, and they struck, and next thing you know, we then had to go through, and we had all these servers we took out. It was crazy, but our board now, what we do is every audit committee, we have a committee, all board meetings, and every board member attends, and we have about 3 hours on cyber, which is really interesting. In the past, we had a good plan. Didn't have any Bitcoin, okay, when it was all said and done. And we thought we had a really, really, really good system. We have 85 million patient records that we manage. 85 million. One record leaks, it costs $1 million. So $50,000 sounds like a pretty good bargain at the end of the day to pay on ransomware. But I heard the comments earlier. We prepared the best we could. I think that the lesson we learned is you're going to get hacked. It's going to happen. It's what you do. And the fact that we actually had a playbook ready to go, and we never thought we were going to have to dust it off, and we literally dusted it off. But I will tell you, put some cryptocurrency in there, because that's how the thieves like to get paid.
How did you know they were going to play nice?
We did, time they called. Yeah. They literally, we found, the question was, how did we know they're going to play nice? We really didn't. They let us know in the middle of the night. So the real activity starts about 6 a.m. in the morning, and this was at 4 a.m. in Chicago. And so they gave us a little bit of time. It took us, like I said, a very short period of time. And then they literally took the ransomware off. We still went through the whole process of letting everybody know. Yeah. It was very expensive.
The interesting part is on some of those when they do that, like when NotPetya and WannaCry happened, we were working with a healthcare company. It was a small hospital down in Southern California, and they were trying to get back up, and they were trying to pay the amount, and they couldn't. The bad guy's website was not accepting, and they had customer service. They literally had a ticketing system. And they were saying, look, I'm trying to pay you your ransom so we can get our MRI machines to working, and they said, well, we're going to unlock it. Please just pay it again later. Right? Like, you know, you sure you're okay? Like, you know, like only pay us half, it'll be fine, right? And you go like, I know a lot of Silicon Valley companies that I wished had that good of a customer service. Yeah. I really do.
Anyways, I've got a couple others, but I'll just stop there.
So Stephen Booth is the Chief Information Security Officer of Fireye. If you could give us a little background,
Sure.
You're the one that is obviously responsible for not only information security, but briefing your board at Fireye. So if you could give us a little background on what you're doing, what you see presently, and what you see happening in the boardroom and the executive staff in Fireye. And obviously you have a different angle because you guys are threat experts to many
Sure.
different companies.
So formerly VeriSign, Microsoft, et cetera, lots of positions that were a lot of fun. I did a lot of post-breach consulting. So like I worked a breach at a chemical company where they exfiltrated the entire coatings division intellectual property out the thermostat on the wall, because the thermostat on the wall had an embedded Linux, and they could get to a network that didn't have the full packet capture. Japanese car company operating out of Ohio that had thousands of administrators, and they were talking about how to clean up their breach, and the bad guys just turned on the triangle phone in the middle of the room and listened in on the entire meeting without even turning on the lights, right? So like, the funny part is what you're talking about is sort of a Thursday for me, right? I mean, like, I think every company has their own ways that they're unique, right? We all have, we go like, oh, that wouldn't happen to me because whatever. I don't do the it wouldn't happen to me, but I do have the whatever part of it, right? It's not very likely that any of you have people like Lee that would be at a conference and have a former KGB agent walk up to him and say, please stop talking about the Russians. That's actually happened to us. I've had a C-star-O that got a LinkedIn message that was saying, hey, good presentation at that thing you were at last Thursday. I'm the person you talked to after your presentation. Here's the information I said I would send you. It's not an email. It's not anything that's going to go traverse our company systems at all. It was a LinkedIn message on their phone, right? So when I am a customer of the kind of information that Lee's talking about, because I am, we literally talk about my group and protecting us corporately as customer number one. It's not that I actually care Azerbaijan versus Albania, but I really care about those techniques, right? There was an example I was given in the break here. We were talking about, we'd caught the Russians that was doing, they were doing an operation inside a financial institution in London. And when they had come in and popped some accounts, rather than like getting into ugly, what can I do with this account? They just went into Office 365 and delegated their email to a fake secretary. And you go like, imagine how horrible it would be if your CEO or your chief legal counsel, their email was able to be read by Russia whenever they wanted to, right? And you go like, okay, what do I have to do corporately in order to protect that situation? Which, by the way, there's no technology on the planet that will tell you which delegations are evil and which ones aren't. It takes human wherewithal. Now, in the way that we do stuff, board conversations, I am a little blessed in that my execs are probably among the most security aware execs on the planet. They really are amazing. Although I will say that they tend to be more breach aware than we call it blue team, the defense team, right? my CEO like doesn't care about DLP, right? He goes, that's a compliance thing. Like, okay, our regulators care. Like, you know, when I'm talking to the chief financial officer, he cares about Sarbanes-Oxley stuff, and he doesn't want the Russians to do something with us, but that's more of a, don't cause my stock price to have an issue, right? So one of the things about my position, the chief security officer position, is how do I figure out how to put things on mental radars, you all should pay attention to this, while simultaneously saying, and by the way, don't worry about it because I'm taking care of it, right? It's a weird give and take. There's a push and a pull to it. Our board members, often boards ask the same questions. So regardless of your industry, they'll all ask the same, like, are we doing sufficient levels of controls to protect ourselves from, you know, cyber problems, without even knowing what the cyber problems are, right? The question that they're asking me is literally, they want me to smile and nod, and my answer is always no, never, never. I've never worked for any company ever where I said, oh, we're fine, right? Like, oh, we're safe. As soon as your CISO says you're safe, fire him. So anyways, in bloody war story terms, I could do this all day. I have some really cool stories, but I don't want to take over everybody else's time slots.
Great. Kim's currently a CMO of Gigamon, and she's been the CMO for multiple security companies, so she carries not just a generic CMO of companies, carries a security background as well, so you bring a lot of domain expertise in this. But it'd be great to hear your background and, you know, obviously having a security domain expertise from the marketing side, but also, you know, step out of that role. If you can tell us a little bit about, you know, what CMOs are dealing with, you know, who aren't in your pocket of having that domain expertise. So if you can share some.
Sure, happy to be here. So yes, I'm currently the CMO at Gigamon, and we are not a security company, but we make security tools work better. We do network packet brokering. So we send the network traffic, which we believe is the source of truth, to the downstream tools like Fireye, like others, that use them to process, to figure out what's happening in the network traffic. And one of the very important things that we do is we don't swamp a downstream tool. So there's no reason to send web application traffic, for example, to a tool that can't interpret it, right? So you just fork it off to a different place. And it's interesting. I was previously the CMO at another security company, and that's when I became very security aware. Because prior to that, you know, you're in marketing. You want to spin up a Box instance to share some files back and forth? Exactly. You just spin it up. You know, I was very good at shadow IT because I needed to get stuff done. You know, before this, I've been at bigger companies like Citrix and BMC. And I just did what I needed to do to run marketing. And so when I was at my last company, it was actually Imperva, which many of you may know. That's when I became very security aware and had to click into a different zone, which is I had to go talk to my CISO and run a security check on all kinds of things that I wanted to do to make sure that I wasn't compromising the infrastructure. So I got a lot better.
I would have told you what you were doing.
Oh yeah, you would have known. Exactly. But a lot of
by the way, your password's not great. But
right,
you know.
Yeah, it is now. But you know, it's funny because you think about it from the perspective of just needing to do your job, as all of you do. And you, especially today with all the great SaaS tools that are available, you just spin up what you need and you take it down when you're done and you move on. But that is a very dangerous proposition. You've got to click up your knowledge about that. So I think about security from a couple of perspectives. Number one, right now we are a partner of Fireye. We feed a lot of security tools, so we have to think about things differently. And also as the chief marketing officer, when a breach happens, your CMO needs to be your best friend, right? If you two, I know, Vasu, you're probably talking regularly. Exactly. But you have to have that crisis communications plan ready to go, right? And not just in a drawer. I'm glad you had one, Mike. But I encourage people to practice them because you never know what's going to happen until you've practiced it. So a good friend of mine is the former CISO of Cigna. And they used to do a lot of practicing of their playbook, and then they would throw a variable into it. Like, okay, the CEO is scuba diving in the Caribbean. Who's in charge? Who assumes risk? Who makes the decisions? So one of my big kind of platforms is the need for marketing people to understand security from the perspective of the tools they need and that they use, also from the perspective of communications when a breach happens, and as we've heard, they're in your system. The question is how quickly you can find them and what you therefore then do about it. And I think the other thing is, of course, the brand reputation impact. So a few years ago when I was at my previous company, we uncovered a black hat SEO scheme, which relative to what you talked about is just mice nuts. But it's an interesting thing to a marketing person because the threat actors were actually using SQL injection to put code strings in websites that would send them to counterfeit good sites that you can't really promote the normal way you would promote a website. So it might be fake Louis Vuitton or male drugs that would be put in legitimate companies' websites, compromise their SEO rankings, and send an unsuspecting visitor off to an illicit website. And so I think about it also from the brand reputation perspective is, what are you going to do to get your brand back up and running as quickly as you can? How do you go about that restoration process? Because today in security, it's really more about resilience. How quickly can you bounce back? And it's not just bouncing your systems back after you've had a ransomware incident. It's also how resilient is your brand? And how do you manage it so that when something bad happens, you're able to handle it and you're able to quickly jump back? So I really look at it from multiple perspectives. I also spend a lot of time advocating for discussions between board members and CISOs and getting together so that you understand each other's language. Because quite frankly, if you go in and you start talking about, it's a layer 4 volumetric DDoS attack, all of the board members are just gonna kind of glaze over. They don't know what the heck that means. So it's really—
It is fun to do, though.
It is fun, right? I like to do it too, because nobody expects a marketing chick to know that stuff. But you have to learn how to translate so that as the board member, you can ask the right questions. And as a member of the C-suite, whether you're the CISO or the CIO or the CEO or even in my role, you can actually explain it to people in a way that they can understand. So from a marketing perspective for me, there's just tons of different avenues that you have to pay attention to when you work in the security world especially, but also as you help everybody understand the importance of what they need to do every day.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Mark Tonneson has been currently CIO of Freedom Financial. He's been CIO of 4 or 5 different companies, and out of transparency, he was my boss at Cisco. And I remember when 9/11 happened, he was taken out at the request of the Transportation Security Agency, obviously authorized by Cisco to go help them fix everything after 9/11. But Mark, if you can give, obviously, some interesting background there. If you can give some of that background and what the changing trends of CIOs are today and how they're interacting with the boardroom.
Yeah, happy to, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, I've been in the technology space for a long time, CIO roles, of course, but most of my background's been either in high tech or I was CIO and ran security at McAfee, kind of similar to his role. Just you're always the second most knowledgeable person, at a security company. Then I did my time, as it were, right after 9/11 in Washington. So that was most of the stories I can't talk about, but we did do our best, that's for sure. But where I'm working now, Freedom Financial, we're obviously a financial services company. When I think about security and really how to make my company successful, obviously make them more secure and do my job, a lot of my time is not, and my efforts and priorities are not in my control. So we're highly regulated, we're heavily audited, and so we're constantly worried about our information, our data, our clients. We are direct to consumer, so we have millions and millions of clients that we support either in reconstruction of their debt or in issuing loans and other things. And so we're constantly worried about the threats that are out there and stealing both information causing destruction for our company and our brand. So one of my biggest challenges, though, is that because I don't have complete control over my priorities, the regulators want this, that, and the other put in place. I'm trying to educate folks that our threats are more likely over here. Just as by way of example, we've had somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 incidents just this year, and the vast majority of those were caused by employees, either in a couple of cases purposeful, and in most cases not, and just by accident. And so we're constantly trying to educate our executives and the board and obviously the regulators that we need to put more focus in certain areas where we see threats. Obviously, like in today's discussion, there are other things that we need to be looking at in the foreseeable future, but we have to address the here and the now. And for me, the language that I use in trying to communicate the need, the risk, the probability of that risk is very, very important, so that I can get the right behavior. For me, of course, the right budget, right, to get some investment so that I can actually do something is really, really important, and it's a constant struggle. So what we've tried to do is, obviously at the board level, we're trying to build more and more of an education process so that we have greater awareness throughout the board. Certainly bringing in external security expertise onto the board is a big win. But just within the management team in general, a real sensitivity to the priorities, to what we see, so that we make the right investments. There's a slew of things that our security team and myself would like to do, but you've got to stack rank these things in some ways based on budgets and resources, and it's the reality of running a business. But I like to use the vectors of risk and probability to help me make better decisions, because I could do a bunch of things around power grid issues and earthquakes and monsoons, but they're going to happen once every 50 years. I'd rather worry about the 27 incidents I've had this year around people's behavior, and so those are the kind of things I'm struggling with to try to educate the board around. How do we think about making better decisions? Because it's sometimes it's whack-a-mole. They hear something and they want to go after it, and I'd like to put a little bit more intelligence and data behind making these decisions. So that's what I'm thinking about and what I'm worried about. And then, of course, as was mentioned, Kim pointed out, what I've just talked about is everything I know, and what I can't really talk about, and what I don't know what I'm going to be thinking about next is what is out there that I don't know, right? So who are the bad guys that are in my network, and how do I know? And so I've got this mental strategy that I'm putting together formally, which is I've got to have a great outer shell protection strategy, right? And there's a number of things we all do, and those are tried and true. And then it's the bad guys passed all that, right? So they're in your network. How do you detect them? So there's a protection and a detect strategy, and that's the place I'm really trying to focus on next, is how do I really detect that they're in there? How long have they been there? They've been in there 101 days, and they're about ready to strike. How many of them are in there? What's the behavior? What are we seeing, right? And then what's the remediation, right? You got to have a way to remediate, respond. Obviously, the external communications is a big piece, but just internal, how do we marshal the right people? Who quarterbacks the situation? How do we get things done more quickly? So having that 3-component strategy for me is a big one.
James Budge is the CFO of Pluralsight. He's taken a number of companies public, CFO, COO. So James, if you kind of give us a background, what is the perspective of a CFO that's thinking from the financial implications of either taking a company public or one that's already gone public, and what they're thinking about relative to security issues and how that impacts the company from the CFO perspective?
Yeah, happy to. First, I want to say my greatest claim to fame is I was able to coach, even though Mike looks a lot younger than I do, I was able to coach his grandson in baseball, who was an outstanding pitcher. My son was the catcher, and Brian's son was the shortstop. So we were the Yankees in Los Altos Little League. We were outstanding. So that the thrill, and my last season in baseball here was my last coaching season, which was a huge bummer. But I've been doing, as Brian said, I've been a CFO in and around Silicon Valley for about 20 years, and I got tired of it, so I took a gig in Salt Lake, even though I live here. So I commute back and forth there, and who we are at Pluralsight has some relevance here. We're a tech skills platform. We did go public earlier this year in May. We have about 6,800 courses in any form of technology, about 400 of which are in the field of security. So we have a lot of authors, kind of experts in their field, 1,300 that contribute into our platform, and we make that available on a subscription basis for anybody here that is not a customer, although you probably are, since we have 65% of the Fortune 500 as customers and 15,000 businesses. So it's a good business, and we do think about security. It's a leading edge technology. We're always, we have an entire team that is out finding authors for us that create content, put it on our platform, and make a little side money, moonlighting in their second job with the platform that they have. They get a return and rev share arrangement from us. So, technology, security, specifically data science, and everything around machine learning are sort of the three hottest areas for us, and the things that our customers that use our platform are clamoring for the most. So it's very relevant to our business. It's also very relevant, kind of a subcategory around security. Privacy is really important to us. We sell 35% of our business in Europe, and things around GDPR and privacy matters are super important there. So if we didn't think about that on a regular basis, we felt like we were GDPR compliant by May of earlier this year, which is when everyone was expected to be if you wanted to do business in Europe. And we met that need, and specifically for our users of our platform, privacy is super important to them because they receive skill scores in the competencies and technologies they're trying to learn on our platform, and they really don't want, a typical developer doesn't want their boss looking over their shoulder on their skill score thinking it might turn them into getting fired the next day if they have a bad skill score in a particular technology. So privacy around that and anonymization capabilities for our platform are super important. So all of that, and we're not a security business, but we are sort of tangentially related. But as it relates to the CFO gig and how I've seen the transformation, I would second many of the thoughts that have been shared here, and I'll just drill in on a couple specifically. My last, until this opportunity to take a company public, my last one was in 2012, and then I went into some private equity deals in between and decided to spit out here. But back in 2012, in audit committees that we had and board meetings, which whether good, bad, or indifferent, I usually attend all of them. And the concepts around security were rarely spoken, at least in the circles, the companies I ran in 2010, 11, and 12. And now when I bring it forward into 2018, in our audit committee meetings, we spend about a third of our discussion. We don't have all the board members come, but we do have our most technical person come. She's the former CIO of Walmart and is head of all digital at GlaxoSmithKline right now, so she's like our expert on our audit committee related to all things technology. And she gives just brings great experience to our audit committee, and we bring our CISO, we bring our CIO and others into that meeting and spend a lot of time talking about security areas where 5-6 years ago we would have spent no time talking about it. I want to give a second thought on what Kim mentioned. Again, while security, we're probably not getting hacked and attacked like, or at least talking about it all the time like a Fireye. It is important to us, and as a result, we've created an incident response team in our organization. Kim talked about how you want to get that team together and go through like examples and, hey, this happened. We have a fun little game we play where we get together and we roll a dice, and if you roll the right number on the dice, then certain bad thing happened, and if it didn't, then you got out of it safely, and then we role play like, okay, this happened, what would we do? And that just sets us up nice for when and if something real actually happens. So that's a meeting we go through every other week. It's that important to us. The incident response team is 5 people. It's the CIO, it's the CISO, it's somebody in legal, our number 2 person in legal, and a couple of other folks in there that sit on the CISO's team, and they report into our command team, which is the CIO, myself, and our general counsel. And then if something rises to an incident level, we have a 1 through 5 scale. If it gets into sort of DEFCON 5 territory, then we have a path where we alert the audit committee and certain members of our board, and we alert the CMO from a press perspective. So there's a really good I think, process that we have rolling right now, and we meet regularly. We have, on top of that, we have 10 sort of run the business meetings that we have inside of our business, and these are things like, hey, how are billings going in the pipeline? That's probably the most important meeting. So billings and pipeline, super important, but we also have a people run the business meeting. We have a systems run the business meeting. We have M&A run the business meeting, and one of our top 10 is specifically around security. So we have a security run the business meeting where we meet every 6 weeks as a big, broader group, and we talk about all things security related. So at least from the trends that I've seen relative to the last 5-10 years, it's really important. And I'm guessing in companies where that's what they do around security, it's probably 100 times more important. But even for us, it's super important how we think about it. So that's what I'd leave you with.
So I'm going to ask one question to the panel that I want them all to answer. And while they're answering it, I want you guys to think of the next set of questions. And my question is, what does the next generation of person in your role need to be understanding as it relates to security, just based on this constant need? We heard from Lee, we hear breaches. What is the next generation of CEO, chairman, what does the next generation of CISO, CMO, CIO, CFO need to have? Partially because we have both those people in our group, and obviously the people that are aspiring to be those people in our group. What are the changing set of things that they have to understand as it relates to security to be viable candidates to be a CEO or a chairman, Mike, and so on? I'd like to get your opinions on that. And then I'll open it up for questions in the audience.
That's pretty broad, because it's like saying, I always used to hear, what's the characteristics of a CEO? What's the characteristics of a CMO? What I found, which is interesting in all the different companies, it comes down to, at the end of the day, if there's anything that goes wrong, people kind of huddle back and they go, how does this affect me? It's, the company could have got hacked, but does that mean it was on my watch and I'm going to get fired? So it all kind of comes down to how you're going to go ahead and how you're going to react to that. What we find is we're pretty open. There's a working knowledge. We're first to admit the guys that are really good are first to admit what they don't know. We talk about having plans in place. We do. You literally talk about what happens. You do it in an environment. I think the thing that's interesting for us is when you're in the middle of a crisis, sometimes it's really hard to think rational. You're in the survivalist mode. When you're not in the crisis and there's a crisis that goes on, you actually can look back and go, this is what we said we're going to do, no matter how distasteful it could possibly be. So I think what we look for in folks is, the agility, the thinking. You're never going to be as technical as a lot of the folks in the room, but you know who to hire and what kind of technical people to hire. The boards that we have, I'll share one story about the board. It was interesting. 2 public boards, both of them had a security breach. One of them was a different environment. It was a short seller. You guys were talking about Elon Musk. We got Elon Musk, if you will, in one of my companies. And our investment lost almost $300 million in that overnight. Stock fell 40%. What's interesting is the next day there were 15 lawsuits, derivative lawsuits against us. All the lawyers come out. Now, one's against the short seller. What's interesting is you can't file a claim against them, because when they publish a report, they're very smart. There's 2 pages up front that says, hey, by the way, I'm a short seller. I'm going to tell you all the bad stuff. May not be accurate. But then there's herd mentality that goes after that. And the stock fell. A week later, it came back up. In the meantime, we're dealing with lawsuits that are still frivolous and going away. He made a lot of money. We got our money back up, but think about that. No repercussions at all on somebody who publishes false news. 0. And it's written right there. What was interesting is when we look at the boards and so forth, in both instances, one of the boards, everybody says, how does it affect the clients? The clients, is another board, 7 out of the 8 independent board members said, are clients okay? Are they back up and running? Do we lose any health records? And one board member says, what's our D&O insurance look like? Think about that. It was more about self-preservation from that. So we have a new board member. That's kind of the net when it was all said and done, because culturally, when we were looking at it, is how do you react in a crisis? So,
thank you, Mike. So, Stephen, you know, the changing nature of the CISO role is relevant. It really became prominent in the last 10 years as security has risen. Usually an afterthought of IT. Now it's you know, sometimes directly reporting to the CEO. Tell us a little bit about where the emerging trends of the CISO role are, and what the next generation of CISOs need to have that are different, that are from today.
So I'll actually use this whole panel as the backdrop. In a GDPR relevant fashion, we need to pay people who don't work for us, and we have to do this right now, but we have to stack rank our projects that go through the CIO, and if not, Shadow IT is going to get this one done all the way, and by the way, don't get us screwed up so that our stock price doesn't go. That's my job. And I love that. Actually, I do. An awful lot of what the sort of the next generation of CISO looks like is you're skiing downhill. It's going to happen no matter what, right? The things that you prioritize may not be what I wanted. Tough shit. It's happening. Do it, right? What I have to do is I just have to avoid the trees, right? So what I need to do is enable you to do your job well, right? And the good news is when you're doing something that was stack ranked off of your priority and you got budget off of it, I can just torque that just a little bit to say, okay, if you just don't do these bad things, great, keep going, right? And if I can do that for every single moving part, sooner or later, even the shadow IT, I'm just going to go do something and not tell you about, sooner or later, it will become easier to do it the way that I can set up. And seriously, I've built this in multiple places, right? Where you end up with the engineer that says, I just have to do this right now. Awesome, all you gotta do is fill out this one form, and in 20 minutes, you'll have it all built in Amazon by our default architecture. Perfect, go for it. You can have 1,000 of those if you want. I actually believe that the CISO role is cultural change. I believe that our job is to figure out how to steer the humans in ways that we want them to do what they're doing. I want the innovation coming out of the CIO org. I want my marketing people to create me problems. Now, do I want my Intel group to go publish a report on a Pakistani APT group and then have to worry about them punching me in the face? Not really. I don't have a choice. That is what we do.
We do warn you in advance. I said to Matt, hey, we're doing this Iran thing, so be ready.
I got a 4-day heads up on that one. Like, hey, Pakistan might come after us.
I was on vacation.
Yeah. And we're fine, right? Like, we're safe, right?
So far.
Yeah. But it's not a question as to whether or not you're going to the cloud. You're already in the cloud. Go, right? And if you're, as a CISO, if you're not paying attention to it, you're failing at your job, right? It's not a matter of, oh, if I could just have them not do this stuff. No, I'm also a shareholder. Go do it, and go do it faster, and go do it in a way where, like people talk about the DevSecOps is the term that everybody gets into. I've got people on my staff that get pissed off if somebody wants to buy a tool that doesn't already have APIs so I can go build this into my Ansible runbooks to go automate this thing. Like the security guys are pissed off that we don't have attachment points to go do the automation. That's important. Now, the flip side, and when I do these talks at CISO conferences, we have to be able to do this with staff that you can actually hire, right? You're not always going to be able to hire the amazeballs packet whispering cyber expert. You're going to get the guy that used to be on the service desk and he used to build your laptops and he thinks this would be fun to go do security and it's his second job ever in security. Yeah, go. That's the guy who's going to work your second shift SOC queue, and you have to be able to build your organization around that guy. And if you can't, you're failing as a CISO. Being able to work in those always moving intangibles. How do you do that stuff? We actually just had a thing earlier today at one of my staff meetings, and we just completed 7 or 8 audits in the last several months as the certifications, that kind of stuff. And we're like, okay, that was great, good job. However, what are we going to do differently now? How do I do them better? How is it that I can make these go easier the next time that I do it? How can I make my engineers have to spend less time providing evidence and more time doing the engineering job, right? All of those kinds of things, being able to manage that change and handle the humans through the process and stages of grief. I don't know what it is about people that don't ever like to have things change as they're telling you things have to change, right? I actually do believe that that's the security job. I hear lots of jokes at CISO conferences. One of them talks about the CISO as the chief scapegoat officer. One of them talks to him as the chief get shit done officer. Like I've seen all kinds of variations on that one.
What about the career is suddenly over? You heard that one too, right?
Wow, that went dark quick. You know, there's a lot of former CISOs. There's not as many repeated CISOs. But it's a fascinating way that it goes. The good news is it's actually becoming odd to have the CISO report to the CIO. It's not a best practice. It's not. The problem is some companies get around that by not having a CISO. They just go like, oh, he's a CIO and you're in charge of security. Okay, no, that's even worse. Like, you can't argue with yourself.
Yeah.
You know. So, I love what I do though.
So Kim, you used to just have to create demand for your product, but now you have to think about beyond lead gen and branding and pricing, you know, crisis management and reputation. So what does the next generation of CMO have to think about as it relates to, you know, a different world where, you know, security breaches are, you know, inevitable?
Yeah, great question. So I think Mike made a good point. I think mental agility is really important in any C-level exec, but particularly a marketing person, because you've got to be able to take in new facts, quickly react, don't get too wedded to something, you know, be able to move at the pace of business, at the pace of digital, and don't, you know, just go faster, you know, do faster. I think that's really important. I think the other thing is that marketers need to become more business people who happen to specialize in marketing versus marketing people who are worried about pretty shapes and colors and logos and brands and so on, right? And if you do that, then I think you can play well in the changing world where security is something you have to think about every single day. I mean, we just launched, at Gigamon, we launched a new community to bring our customers together to help share best practices and, you know, network and give us feedback. And, you know, ordinarily you might just put one up, right? But this time we had to really think about the security implications, not only of spinning the site up, it's in the cloud, we've got all the right things with our stuff and your stuff and a bunch of stuff around it. But you also have to think, if one of the things that you're doing is encouraging customers to share code, ooh, what does that mean? Right? It's not just answering questions and did you do this, did you do that? They're sharing code snippets, right? So what's the obligation that you have as the steward of that community if somebody's got a code snippet out there that's got a back door that you helped propagate out to your thousands of customers, right? So they're just, that's what I mean by mental agility. You've got to think around edge cases. You have to think about not the happy place. Marketing people like to be happy, and we are happy. We're also the chief corporate cheerleader, right? I think my job is two parts, chief corporate cheerleader and chief problem solver. But you have to be able to anticipate kind of the downside and be ready for it and be seen as a key source of help and corporate stewardship along with the board, the CEO, and the other C-level execs. So it's a changing role. And then you think about all the tools that we use today, right? And making sure that the tools that we use to do our jobs are not putting us in a compromised position, whether it's, you know, PII, you know, getting us in GDPR trouble because we just didn't think about it right. I mean, so you've got to be just much more broadly minded than just worrying about the conference or the lead gen campaign or whatever it might be. And that's why I think thinking more from a business perspective that happens to specialize in marketing is going to be increasingly important for marketers going forward.
Great. Mark, you know, tell us about the changing trends of the CIO role. Stephen commented, you know, on the organizational structure of where CISOs should report. What are your comments around your role and where it's going?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so I agree with the comment that the security officer shouldn't report into IT. I mean, they have to report somewhere, but you know, and you could, if you get the right person, as long as they operate independently and develop those kind of relationships, it could operate and report really anywhere. But I do agree, reporting into IT is not a really good place to be. Start there. But relative to CIOs, I mean, I think we're always under the gun, you know, with, you know, number one goals, you know, lower cost, right? And number, you know, 1B or, you know, 2 would be, you know, you have to innovate and try to get things done faster, and you're never as good as you need to be in either one of those camps. But relative to security, one of the things that I've learned over the course of time, and it's a very simple concept, which is, like anything else, right? Building quality into a product up front is cheaper than fixing the product later, right? And so building security into your products, the way you do things, your processes, how you deploy technology, how you test, all of that. If you do that up front, and therefore, for me, developing a strong relationship with my CSO and the security team, other engineers, so that we are hopefully an educator, a communicator, and doing a much better job of communicating why it is we want to get security embedded earlier versus later. Because it's so easy for an engineer or an engineering manager or anybody in a product role to say, well, to do what you're asking is going to cost X millions of dollars, or we're going to lose time, and nobody wants to do that, and you always get voted off the island, right? So I'm really thinking that more and more, as much as I got to focus on costs and I got to get things done much faster, I've got to find a way to make sure my engineers and every part of the processes that I manage has security built in up front, and I don't think we're anywhere near there. Certainly in the companies I've worked for. We're getting better in where I'm at now, but we're clearly not there. And I'd say that's something that the CIO has got to be able to evangelize, not only within his own organization or hers, but throughout the rest of the company.
James, why don't you share what the emerging trends and next generation CFOs need to be thinking about relative to security different than what they're doing right now?
Yeah, well, I think they've been thinking about it for a few years now, but if I just go back, say, 10 years ago, I think you had your pretty boilerplate CFO of accounting, finance, maybe a little bit of tax, and if you were public, some investor relations in there. And it seems like around 2005, at least for me anyway, that the CIO area, specifically around business applications, started to find their way into the CFO world. And that's because a lot of times CFOs seem to be pretty good at process-oriented activities. At least that's how it worked out for me. And then if I fast forward that for probably 5 to 7 years, around that 2010, 2012 timeframe, it seemed like areas like security started to become a lot more important. I would agree, at least in our world, the CISO reports into our chief experience officer, who is our head of development or R&D, depending on what title you want to give him, but for us it's the chief experience officer, so CISO reports up into that, even though IT actually reports into me, so we have a dual-pronged approach to how we attack security, both from the IT side and the CISO side that fits into the product. So I think anything in and around security started to become more important. Recently, it doesn't have anything to do with this discussion, but data science has become super important, like having data scientists in and around the organization that live in our organization, live in my world, has become super critical to the success of our business, and just really taking really data-driven approach to how you make decisions. But clearly, at least in the worlds I've been in, security, in and around IT things, security, data privacy, and a data science-backed approach to how you make decisions have become 3 of the most important trends that I've seen.
Boy, talk about that one as one of those ones where doing that one well, like you want that to go really fast. If you want to succeed, you have got to lean way forward on the data science thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there are not established norms as to how to do that one, except for like building moats around it, which never works. Like that doesn't let you enable it very well.
Yeah.
You got to dive in and do that one in really forward-leaning terms.
Yeah, agree.
So just to amplify and reinforce the message that all of you have been sending, particularly Steve, Mark, and Kim, a friend of mine is CSO at Hewlett-Packard, which is a $52 billion company, and they take 2 days a year where they lock up their entire executive staff. And in the first day, they've had, if you can believe this, 2 movie crews where they've shot fictional news reports about a hacker attack with ransomware demanding Bitcoin, and all of the constraints of what's happened to their systems internally is listed. And every hour a chime goes off and new reports come in on this model that they're asked to respond to. And each hour, they're supposed to list their actions or decisions and their communications. And the communications are not supposed to be fully flushed out, they're bullet form. But each hour goes by, and now the demands have changed from the ransomware people, and they're shifting, they're intransigent, and this is what's happening with the investment press. And here's the run on the stock, and what happened was, like Mike was talking about, here's what's happening to our worth on the equity markets. And at what point do you inform the board? At what point do you inform the financial press? At what point do you inform the employees? At what point do you inform the vendors? And what do you say to each of those constituents? And then the chime goes off, and here's a whole new set of conditions, and here are the decisions you need to make in the next hour. And that goes on for 10 hours. And we're talking about a $50 billion company that's investing $250,000 to shoot fictional financial press reports with a TV camera and fictional news reports about a ransomware project, hiring actors and the whole thing. And then they do another one 6 months later, and they review the decisions and actions they took and then critique them along with the CXOs team of what might be a slight tweak and improvement on what they did. So it's not a question, it's sort of re-amplifying what you guys have all been saying, and saying even at a $50 billion company level, people are taking this really seriously and investing a heck of a lot of mind share and investment in trying to solve these problems.
Any comments from the? I have a.
Good.
Yeah.
Those things are fun to do. I did one with an airline, and we actually got to the point where all the execs were saying, "Never mind, we give up, file bankruptcy." we were doing the internal malicious employee, and we were doing things like taking senators and putting their entire delegation on the no-fly list while they were in the air, right? So when you get the bad guys doing this, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we've got a question here.
So as the leading cybersecurity professionals, where do you see the next trend for vulnerability being? I mean, certainly retail has seen its fair share. Could it be data aggregators? Could it be cybersecurity companies getting hacked themselves to break down their systems? What are you seeing as a trend in the network?
The funny part is, first off, I would say it could be anybody. Everybody who said that, oh, we're not a target for whatever, they've almost universally been proven wrong. So that's one part. In trend terms, however, there's a lot of them that are out there. The easiest example, though, is you started by saying vulnerabilities. There's an odd follow the data. Okay, so we all got to the point where we said, like, hey, oh my God, we have to do our patching, we have to do vulnerability management. Something like 90% of the vulnerabilities in the world have never been exploited ever. Like, yes, you had to do your patching, and we all freaked out when it hit the Wall Street Journal, and oh my God, most of them were never used by bad guys.
Right.
Now, one of the things that we do as a company is we focus almost totally on what is it that bad people are doing, right? I'm not interested in what happens if I click on some, crappy email that's a little less interesting. I'm way more interested if that same email came from Iran, right? That's a totally different situation. Now, the scary part gets into what do you do when the normal, boring commodity crapware that ends up saying, hey, I've got a laptop that's compromised at Fireye, do the Iranians want to buy it, right? So that's where the risk management side of this goes. I think that in predictions terms, and I think most people that make predictions are wrong, so I'm going to say that one right up front. I know, I just did our security predictions video yesterday, is why I'm saying this. There's going to be some ugly new things in ways that people may not have thought of. So for instance, you go into Amazon, there's an awful lot of the whole serverless stuff. You go in after like, okay, how do you end up having attacks on Lambda calls? Well, we've seen them. We literally have seen them. In fact, even worse, there's some totally cool, I love these guys, ways to go in and make a Lambda call to issue a future Lambda call and then delete itself. So when you go look at what are my Lambda calls in my Amazon portal, it doesn't show up, but it's coming back in on time. They're funky ways of doing this stuff because the bad guys are evolving into cloud. Welcome to it. It's how it goes, right? 20% of the breach and IR work we do involves the cloud, right? We do 200,000 hours a year of this, right? You can real quickly figure out just how often people are just going where the innovation is, right? The good news is the bad guys have the exact same hiring problem we have, right? They do.
They can't find them.
The downside is they can make mistakes over and over again and have it fail, and they don't care until it works, right? Think about what would happen if our security ops team just screwed it up repeatedly, right? No, that's not acceptable, right? So in how does it go, instead of trying to predict what's the exact thing they're going to do, look to where the industries are going. Everybody's going to the cloud. I gave an example of an Office 365 pop. We have a hunt case we do going after evil new duo tokens, two-factor auth tokens. Yeah, we have to investigate every single one of them because we've caught the Russians going in and issuing two-factor auth tokens as the compromised account so they can just get into the VPN as the user and do whatever the hell they want, right? So when you were talking about your couple of dozen issues, mostly people, that also includes where it wasn't actually the human being that did it. So is it a mistake or was it the Chinese acting as that user? The detective capabilities and the ability to do the investigations are basically the same. Now, the good news to that is you can take some of the resourcing and some of the budget you have on things like insider threat, which actually is now useful in cyber terms, right? It really is. Because in order to be able to protect myself from the Chinese impersonating one of my engineers doing horrible things in Active Directory, I can also make sure we don't make mistakes in Active Directory, right? The budget can be applied in kind of innovative ways of doing this if you're following what the bad people are doing, right? The bad people always follow what the good people are doing, just the way it goes, right? The bad guys don't come up with brand new ways of doing things if the old ways work, and people click on links in email. It happens, right? You are never getting that to zero, never. In fact, if you're really good, you have a 15% click-through rate. 15 to 17 is the numbers that come out of the Cofense people. After 1 year of training, 17% click-through rate. Welcome to it. That's world class.
Can I answer to your one other comment? It's more of a practical thing for me when I look at it. So I'm in the private equity world now, and we've got a bunch of companies. And during the process, I spent a lot of money in this company I was looking at in the healthcare space, and to put it as part of another company. It's not gigantic. It's got about 2 million lives in the healthcare space. That's not giant. We were ready to write the check, and we said, well, we just got to finish the security audit. So we hired an outside firm. They went in and they did everything, and they said, time out. They said they're high trust certified. We cracked it like that. They said they're HIPAA. We went through and breached this. We went and did a customer audit, and we found this. And it was interesting. It was a bargain. I mean, I was salivating. The EBITDA that just dripped out of this place was crazy. And we could have probably turned it in less than 2 years. I walked away 2 days ago. And I walked away because I didn't know what I didn't know. But I did know that they had a problem at the host location, and I couldn't trust to go out and look at everything. So we actually pulled the plug. And I spent a lot of money doing diligence, and we actually pulled the plug because of what could happen.
They didn't have your playbook.
It wasn't that. They just got a little sloppy at the back end, and they didn't have I just call it just good, solid processes in place. Now, by the way, they passed our team, but when we got somebody that was really good in to look at it, it didn't pass that. So we thought best and just walked away, and it was hard. People private equity guys don't like to walk away from really good deals, and we actually did.
The funny part is that from my world, the walk away isn't usually what I hear out of that. So we have a consulting engagement we do called a compromise assessment. It goes looking for evidence of persistence. The bad guys are in your network without having the trigger of an incident, right? And we do a version of that at M&A time, meaning I bought this company, can I trust them to connect it into my network? I've talked to several private equity people, and the ones that use this when they go like, all right, it's not a matter whether or not I'm going to buy it or not, it's a matter of how much am I going to pay, right? Now, it felt a little slimy on our side, which was like, go in and find bad stuff so I can get a discount, right? Like, we're not the coupon organization, right? But you're actually the first one I've ever heard of that said I walked away from it.
Yeah, we could have done it. We could have discounted the round, all that. It just didn't make sense then.
Yeah.
And it would dilute the overall value of the other businesses we were going to merge it with. So, anyways, killed the company.
You've got a question. Sue, you've got a question, and Brad's going to be the last question, so make it a good one, and then we'll let the rest roll into the social time.
Pressure's on.
Great. So a question for the audience, and then related to that question, how many of you are on social media? How many of you use personal Gmail, Yahoo? Pick your email address. Okay. All right. And we just heard from Lee on all the social influence operations. So a question back to our panel, and Steve, I know you have some interesting stories around this. How do you prevent an employee, an executive, a company from really understanding the threats? Because as marketers, we want you all to use social media. Kim, you can relate to it. Be ambassadors, share those news, promote our brand, right? But there's a real threat of someone using social media to impersonate you, to hack you, to use your personal email as a backdoor into your company email. So how do you prevent that? And do you have any stories around that in all your respective roles? And what would you recommend to this audience?
I do, but I could do this all day. So I'll do one. We had an incident that actually was semi-public. We had an employee that worked for us out of the country of Israel who was probably top 5% in the world for knowing what are the Syrians doing and what are the Iranians doing in their cyber operations attacking the country of Israel, right? He was really, really good at what he did. And his password into his password manager was @ password.
Oh, dear God.
And this guy's brilliant. He really is. He's brilliant. And that's what the other one is. I'm also the chief WTF officer as well. And in that sort of like, well, now what do you do? We did a whole round of talks to boards of directors of like Fortune 25 companies, where the question was, how far do we have to go as a company to protect our employees' personal lives to protect the company? And when we did this investigation, 100% of the investigation, because we didn't have any breach on our side at all of the investigation was in Google logs and Hotmail logs and OneDrive logs. It was a big pain in the butt. We had, now I work with brilliant people, we had people writing new link analysis tools into Twitter to go figure out what happened for the 2 accounts from the bad guy. It was, we have a bunch of really good nerds on my side. But being able to answer that question is hard, and even more interesting because you were asking about board of directors. When we were talking to our board was saying things like, oh, so maybe we should start using some of the more advanced endpoint protections, the EDR endpoints. We sell one. We couldn't because it got real interesting. If you're my board member and I have my EDR product on your MacBook, I could look up your search history. And you go like, well, I can't protect my board member as well as I could my own corporately issued laptop, but at least one of us has got a BYOD, like bring your own laptop stuff, right?
Yep.
You go like, do I really want the search history of my employee's wife? No, I really, really don't, right? And welcome to it. All of the best technology gives you that level of stuff. It really does. It used to be one of those like, oh, just install the thing or put in the technology, that kind of stuff. Now it is rich and complex and delightful is my favorite word lately. Like, isn't that a delightful security problem?
Brad?
I'll make it a multi-part question just to keep it interesting. So I will relate that I got impersonated. And I got to work and people said, hey, we're out getting the cards. I said, what cards? They said, the ones you asked me to get.
Yeah.
And I said, what cards? They showed me the email trail that came from a private email account that spoofed mine. It said, go get a bunch of Apple gift cards.
And scratch off the
scratch
number
them off,
and
send me things.
a
I've got
picture.
an important customer meeting I want to give away.
Pretty common.
Right? And if it hadn't been that coincidental, hey, we're getting the cards for you, I wouldn't have been able to shut it down. It would just happen. Now it's minor theft, right? But I think that goes on all the time. The question I had for you was, are you more worried about external threats or internal inadvertent and intentional action of employees? Because I have heard, for example, that 1% of the population in any company will click on any link presented to them.
It's way more than that.
Yeah.
And they will always do it, no matter how many times they're warned. They're just, it's like Pavlovian response. I gotta
Actually,
want
the
to see what
numbers
this
also
happens.
show the higher they are in your org, the
More
higher
likely.
that percentage.
That's true.
The smarter they think they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But where are you on the external, internal bias? Because I don't think I'm going to be that likely externally hacked nor do I have the resources to prevent it if it's the Russians or the Chinese. But I do worry that the inadvertent and intentional actions of employees might be a much more common threat to me.
So he's probably got statistics, but insider threat, you look at it in 3 categories: careless, compromised, and malicious, right? And it's more likely, and you can correct me here, but that the compromise is probably your biggest issue. And that's where somebody has gotten credentials and is going to log in as somebody that's a legitimate employee, but it's really not them. And that's where you use various tools to say, why is the CFO logging in from Turkey? You know, he lives in Los Altos, right? So I think that's a pretty important thing. You also need to understand, especially Apple. One of the biggest bounties out there is for an Apple employee who will sell their credentials, right? And so you've got to just be aware of all of these interesting, weird things that are happening to your employees and try to educate them and keep them motivated to be good. Pay them well enough so they're not going to take a $20,000, I want your credentials, right? Because these things are happening. And I'm sure you have more stories and statistics, but from a practical perspective, you know, I think external is a lot bigger. You probably have stats that say external threats are bigger than internal. But
not necessarily more damaging.
Exactly, not necessarily more damaging. You do need to pay attention, and you do need to instrument for both. Right?
I would question the premise of the question, who cares? Like, seriously, who cares where it comes from, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you a good one. This one actually happened to us, kind of Chatham House rules, or edited out of the video. We had one where one of our suppliers, he was actually a lobbyist that we had hired in a different country, he got his credentials lost. So from his actual email that had been interacting with us in finance terms, he said, hey, I got a new bank account, changed my stuff, right? And it was just barely, just coincidentally, under the limit for where we would have done the more rigorous checks, right? And we actually paid the bad guys, right? And you go like, that's kind of embarrassing, actually. It was only a few $1,000s, right? But you go like, I don't really want to give them anything at all. And we did all of the right checks up to a certain risk-weighted measure, right? If the invoice was below a certain amount, you're just gonna make sure it came from where all the other previous communications come from. If it had been millions, it would have been like, all right, we're gonna do other things. And you go, we had no issue there, none. There was not a single issue with the technology on our side. It was our money that was lost. And by the way, this freaking lobbyist still said pay the bill. We're like, nice try. But at that point, you sort of go like, okay, who cares? It doesn't matter if it's internal or extra. It doesn't matter if it's impersonation or it's actually the employee, right?
I thought it might affect the processes you use to detect or prevent it.
No, so let me challenge the thinking for a second. What you're saying is it's going to affect the processes for you to determine which ones you're going to trust more or ignore more, right? You're going to say if it's an internal employee, if I say that one's lower risk, I won't pay as much attention to them. And what I'm saying. Okay.
So if it's, would you use different tools to look for an internal threat than an external threat? And I think you've answered the question.
Yeah.
You said people can spoof the internal. If the credentials get
compromised,
or stolen, you can't tell whether it was internal or external. It looks the same.
Well, it doesn't always look the same, but like for instance, if somebody was going to get into an attack into one of our web properties that our customers log into, that might be a different tool to look at the user behavior analytics than say an internal Active Directory one, okay? That doesn't mean that I'm going to weight them any differently. The threat in this case is account misuse, right? So I have to go have lots of controls around account misuse just because you have to, right? The downside is that in my role, we get a lot of people that just want to buy the magic technology that's the easy button, and I'm going to buy it and ignore it. And I believe Target's probably the best example of they bought it, they had the service to monitor it, they had the events fire off, and they were told. And nobody answered the email, right? It's the humans. There is no patch for layer 8, right? The humans have to do what the humans have to do. And you can always tell who knows their ISO models, OSI models.
Yeah, but I think I just want to build on that. That's a really good point. And I think the security industry, as people who are in the industry, if you go to RSA, go to the conference, there's 1,000 companies out there. And they all are using machine learning and AI and blah, 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 all the same words. And I think the industry is ripe for consolidation because at the end of the day, to Stephen's point, what we're looking for is a compromise. And whether it comes from a bot, from an internal person, an external person, it kind of doesn't matter. And we've artificially segmented all the applications. Oh, it's an insider threat application. Oh, it's a privileged user access application. Oh, it's an endpoint application. At the end of the day, I'm agreeing with you. It kind of doesn't matter. It's somebody is in your house doing bad things, and whether they came in the front door or the garage, you kind of don't care. You just got to find them and mitigate as quickly as you can.
What she said.
I'm in communications. I'm good at that.
So I want to thank the panel for a very eye-opening discussion about what's going on at the C-suite boardroom level around security and your different roles. So if we could all give everybody a hand. We're fortunate enough, as long as Benny wants to have us, hang around in his beautiful tasting room. So as long as we're welcome here, we're going to stay here for half hour afterwards, however long you can stay. Want to thank the film crew, Spiral Media, Spiral Moon, excuse me. And Sue and Nima, and then I want to give a special thank you to Vasu. She had a special role in the event here, so just want to appreciate everybody to make it out. It's a lot to spend a half a day here, fight through traffic, whether you're coming here from different places. If you got traffic after this, I don't care, but hang out here and you can avoid that if you spend enough time at the tasting room. So thanks again for joining, and we'll just hang out for social time for however long you can stay.